Please turn your attention to the word provided by Dr. King.
Good morning, Christ Community Church. It's good to be with you all again. Thank you for having me for this opportunity to share with your youth this morning. I wanted to say thank you to the pastor and first lady of this church, as well as some of the familiar faces that I've seen in our crowd today. Thank my family for being here, members of my home church, and some of my past teachers from high school, actually. And so I just wanted to thank you all for allowing me to come and speak today. Yes, this morning I want to open with prayer before we dive into the word. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to come to your house again this morning and be able to worship you and fellowship with our brothers and sisters in Christ this morning. God, I just thank you for allowing us to arrive here safely. We thank you for waking us up this morning and getting us started this morning. And Father, I pray that you will allow your spirit to be here with us as we open up your word and study this morning. God, I pray that hearts would be changed, hearts will be open to hearing what you have to say. God, use me as your instrument to speak what you want to be said this morning. In your name we pray. Amen. And so this morning, our passage will be from Daniel 3, and I'll allow you to open up your word as we get started there. But this morning, I wanted to share a little bit about how I came to this passage and how I kind of got on this theme of character, good moral character. And so this morning, the title of our message this morning is Time to Take a Stand, Faith Under Fire. And so a couple of weeks ago, I ran across a picture on my Facebook feed. This picture is often referred to as a meme. Now, how many of you in the audience today know what memes are? Okay, so a couple of you. I figured some of my fellow social media users will know what I'm talking about when I refer to memes. But for those of you who don't know, memes are caption photos that are intended to be funny, often as a way to make fun of human behavior and the way that we interact sometimes with each other. They're meant to bring humor to describe the way that our society works, whether it be the church community, college life, dating, and holiday celebrations. Memes were created for our enjoyment. I also have seen some memes, and I love memes because they bring a sense of humor to my life in some times when I'm stressed out or I'm sorrowful. Some of my favorite happen to be the memes of around the holidays, the Thanksgiving memes, and some about college life that can accurately describe my experience. However, the meme that I wanted to show you this morning, and I hope it'll be displayed on the screens, but it came across my Facebook feed, and as I was scrolling, it kind of caught me off guard. The meme, it reads, "I love Jesus and trap music." I can quote Cardi B, and for those of you who don't know, Cardi B is a famous rapper right now that's popular, and Corinthians. "My heart, body, mind, and soul belongs to him, but I do cuss a little. I'm somewhere between Proverbs 31 and Boosie. It's okay. You can be both. He didn't make us perfect. He made us human." Now, as I was reading this meme, I was reminded of how this mentality of being double-minded counteracts with our faith and how it can confuse others around us with our representation of Christ, with the things of this world. Now, some specific things that I've seen as Christians, seen Christians compromise with has been with our entertainment and the things that we allow to be poured into ourselves. We as humans, we're influenced by our music and our TV shows and social media. But we have to learn how to be so careful to filter that entertainment so that it's something that will attract us rather than distract us from Jesus. Have you ever thought about some of the titles of some of our favorite TV shows and how that alone can be seen as a way to lead others astray? Shows like Scandal and How to Get Away with Murder and Modern Family. Now, these are some of the examples that can show others around us who don't believe the way that we do, that we might support certain things such as scandalous acts and murder and homosexuality. But we as Christians, we have to be careful in what we support in the business of entertainment. We should be looking to role models like Ruth and Paul instead of Cardi B and Travis Scott, and reading our word instead of consistently scrolling through our Instagram screens. Our character is what shapes us and defines us as individuals. And something that I think that we need to consider this morning is if our character is a reflection of Christ or is it a distraction from him? Now, as I was thinking about this theme of character and how it concerns me that we're allowing things that we pour into ourselves to corrupt that character, I wanted to find some biblical examples of people who have dealt with these issues before. In the Bible, Daniel's 3 friends were confronted with this same challenge of their Christian character. Their lives were threatened because they refused to worship a man-made idol. However, their faith, it never wavered, and their character, it remained untarnished. They didn't allow the influences of the world around them to affect their representation of God. And so this morning with the youth, I would like to explore this question of what can we as young people learn from these examples that these young men set before us. And so this morning, as I said before, our text is in Daniel 3, and starting at verse 1, and we're going to read through the whole chapter. But I wanted to give some background on where we are as well. Our text, it places us in the time of the Babylonian captivity. Now, they are there because Israel has turned its back on God, and they began to worship other idols and gods. Now, previously, a couple books back, in Jeremiah 11, God gave warning to the prophet Jeremiah that he would bring disaster on the nation of Israel because they were worshiping and indulging in the worship of Baal. Now, this helps us to understand a little something about God's character and even our own. This teaches us that God does not lie. And so when he told them that he would bring disaster, he meant that, and he used this Babylonian captivity to portray that. But it can also teach us something about ourselves, that when we lie and when we sin, there are consequences, and he's sure to follow those through. But I would like to draw your attention to Daniel chapter 3, verse 1, so that we can learn from the example of these godly men. So, chapter 3, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold that was 90 feet high and 90 feet wide, and he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he summoned the satraps and the prefects, the governors and advisors and treasurers and judges and magistrates, and all other provincial officials to come to the dedication of this image that he had set up. And so the satraps and the prefects and the governors and advisors and treasurers and judges and magistrates and all other provincial officials assembled together for the dedication of this image that King Nebuchadnezzar set up. And they all stood before it. And then a herald loudly proclaimed that this is what you are commanded to do. O peoples and nations and men of every language, as soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. and whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Therefore, as soon as the people heard that sound of the horn and the flute and the zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all peoples of every nation and men of every language fell down and worshiped this image. And at the time, there were some astrologers who came forward and denounced the Jews. They said, "King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. For you have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and pipes of all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold. And whoever does not will be thrown into the blazing furnace. But there are some Jews who are among you, O king, that you set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you have set up." And furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, and harp, and pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image that I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king and said, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we need not defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God that we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the image that you have set up." And so then Nebuchadnezzar was even more furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them, it changed. He ordered the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace. And so these men, wearing their robes and their trousers and turbans and other clothes, were bound together and thrown into the blazing furnace. And the king's command was so urgent and the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied together, fell into the blazing furnace. And then the king leaped up to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" And they replied, "Certainly, O king." But he said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in that fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like the son of the gods." And Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps and the prefects and the governors and all of the royal advisors, they crowded around them. And they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies or touched the hair on their heads, or their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of smoke or fire on them. And then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants." They trusted in him, and they defied the king's command, and they were willing to give up their own lives rather than serve or worship any god who is not their own. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. And so this morning, there are 3 areas of focus that we can observe from this story: the demand, the defiance, and the dedication. And so the first aspect that we will explore is the demand. And in Daniel chapter 3, verses 4 through 6, it says, "To you it is commanded, O peoples and nations and languages, that at the time that you hear the sounds of these music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship will be cast immediately into the midst of the burning fiery furnace." Now, there are two ways in this passage that their Christian character was attacked by this command. It was both directly and indirectly. And so Daniel's three friends were challenged by this demand because they had everything to lose if they were disobedient to this king's orders. Not only could they lose their positions that were granted by the king, but they could even lose their very lives. However, they didn't let the fear of losing their resources and their lives threaten their obedience to God. And in the same way, our character could be threatened by people in authority attacking resources to get us to reject Christ. This past week, when I heard about what happened with that mass shooting in Florida, I was very disturbed, and I just think it's so unfortunate how events keep happening like this and can be prevented. And I would encourage you to earnestly continue praying for the families who were affected, by those who were injured, and even the school itself. But because of this tragedy, I was reminded of a mass shooting that took place on October 1st in 2015 at Umpqua Community College in Rosenberg, Oregon. 8 students and a teacher were killed, and 9 others were wounded when a gunman opened fire on a classroom in the Southern Oregon campus. Now, this tragedy was widely known because the gunman was known for singling out Christians. One survivor stated that the gunman began by asking people one by one what their religion was. He would ask them, "Are you a Christian?" To which they would reply yes or no. And if they replied yes, he would respond, "Good. Because you're a Christian, you're about to meet God in about 1 second." This was what he said before he tragically shot and killed them all. Now, this was a hard time for the church and the Christian community because innocent lives were lost because of their proclamation of the gospel. Those 9 young men and women who lost their lives were martyrs who died for the cause of Christ. And even though I pray that you would never experience a scenario like this, we have to recognize that our world is becoming more and more hostile towards the church and its message. We have to be aware of the things in this world that will try to directly distract you from Christ, and we need to ask for his help when you find yourself in any situation similar. Now, that's the way in which these men were attacked directly, but they were also attacked indirectly. Not only were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego verbally commanded to worship this image, they were also the only ones to be disobedient to this command. Now, can you imagine being surrounded in a large group of people like we're gathered here today, and everyone simultaneously at the same time drops to their knees and begins worshiping this image, and the only people still standing is you and 2 of your best buddies? You would be looking around and confused as to why you're still the only one standing. And the peer pressure that they felt of others is another way in which they were challenged to corrupt their character. I can just imagine the justifications that others around them would try to use to get them to bow. They would say something like, "Oh, just pretend, you're not really bowing to this image. You're just trying to get over." Or they would say something like, "Is your life really worth a God that you can't physically see?" But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are courageous men who didn't allow commands or peer pressure to affect their obedience to their God. And in the same way, the world that we live in will constantly try to throw things at us that are going to try and distract us from God and his word. But we have to learn from their example and remain obedient. But that's the demand. And there's another area that we need to focus on, and that's the defiance. In their obedience to God, you have to recognize that they were defying the king's command. And in this next section, the Babylonians stood shamelessly before this king and presented 3 accusations to him. The first was that they were being disrespectful to the king. And the second was that they did not serve his gods. And the third, which is the one that would really infuriated this king, was that they don't worship his image. Now, these accusations, they sent him into a rage, and they teach us a lot about that king's character. We can see from the text that the king Nebuchadnezzar is a polytheist, meaning that he worships more than one god and wants to be like other nations, creating an idol that will unify all the nations in his empire. Now, we can learn from this text that he tries to make himself a godlike figure when he says in verse 15, "And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" However, he doesn't take too well to their response or their disobedience. Their response in verse 16 through 18 is what causes him to respond in his anger and finally cast them into that furnace. They say, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we need not defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God that we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will certainly deliver us from your majesty's hands. But even if he does not," that's a key word right there, "we want you to know, your majesty, we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Look at that determination in their response. I believe that that's what we call faith. They didn't know what was going to happen to them in that furnace. But one thing that they did know, that if the fire did destroy this body, our souls will be with God today. It's important to also note that these men, they have a history of being disobedient to their king so that they could remain obedient to the King of Kings. All 3 men were out of step with the world, but they were in step with God. Now, this is not the first time that these men didn't compromise their character. If we look back to the first chapter in Daniel, we see that Daniel and his 3 friends, they refused to defile their bodies with foods that are considered unclean, as it's written in the scriptures. Now, that's a bold statement of faith, the fact that these 3 friends, they stood their ground and they told their king that they would serve their God till the end, regardless of the outcome. And I think that that's the faith that we so desperately need today. A faith that's unwilling to compromise with the culture of our world. God calls us as Christians to be set apart, which causes us to have to reevaluate and separate ourselves from aspects of this culture that will try to compromise our holiness. But living out that calling that Christ has for us by being set apart, it takes dedication. It's not easy work. And so the final aspect of our text that we will look and examine together is the dedication that can bring about deliverance. Now, I can just picture this in my mind. The king, he orders this furnace to burn 7 times hotter. In the room that you're in, it becomes overwhelmingly hot, and you're bound together with your friends as you're being walked into your death sentence. And the men who are escorting you in drop dead, burning in front of you. Now, this is the point where many of us would just fall to our knees and say, "I give up, and I ask for your forgiveness, King." But even still, the men remain dedicated. Their dedication was unconditional. So whether they lived through this fire or they lost their lives to it, they didn't rest their dedication on the possibility of deliverance. Now, in my sanctified imagination, I wrestled with this question of, when did God join them in the furnace? Could it be that he was with these men the whole time? I believe that God was with them when they took their stand and confronted the king. God was with them throughout this whole process. And that's why they were able to remain cool, calm, and collected. And as we learn from this text, the three friends are spared, and the Lord delivers them from the flames and from the hands of that king. But as it says in verse 24, as the king arose, he was astonished, and he questioned his counselors, saying, "Did we not cast 3 men into the fire?" And they replied, "Certainly, your majesty." But he said, "I see 4 men in that fire, and the 4th, he looks like the son of the gods." And you see, the king even here had to recognize that there's something different about these men. The king, he takes notice of that God's protection. It transcends anything that we can imagine, any of the boundaries that we set here. You can see that when you remain dedicated to the Lord, and even your enemies have to recognize that God is the one who is fighting your battles. God, he delivers these men of good character from the fire. But this is also a testimony to the king and the others who gathered around that this God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is the one true God. And in the same way, saints, our reflection has to be a reflection of God. Our character has to be a reflection of God. When people see us and witness the good works of our character, they should see that 4th man in you. We have to remember that we identify with Christ, and our actions, they have to match up with that. And my final example of this is in August of 2016, Colin Kaepernick began taking a knee during the national anthem at football games as a way of protesting injustice and racial hatred. Now, at first, this sign was taken as a sign of disrespect to those who served in our military and who lost their lives to fight for this country. But after later explaining his reasoning behind taking a knee, many other athletes and sports figures began joining this movement. This one man's actions opened up a conversation and a dialogue on an issue that's often overlooked. This one man's decision led to a movement and a discussion on the topic of race and injustice in our country. And whether or not we agree or not on this topic, there's one thing that each and every one of us has to recognize, and it's the fact that it called attention to an issue. And this same thing is what we have to do with the young church. We need to take the time to address that there's a sin issue. There's a double-minded issue that needs our attention desperately. Are we willing to take a knee to spread awareness about this battle between flesh and spirit? We may not take a physical knee to spread awareness, but maybe it looks like turning the channel from something that could lead you astray, or deactivating your social media pages, or even letting go of people in your life who are not encouraging your walk with the Lord. And so today I would like to challenge you to examine your life of the things that are seen as distractions. There's going to be demands both directly and indirectly that will try to take your attention off of this issue of being double-minded. But are you willing to fully surrender the things in your life that might cause you and others around you to lead astray? The deliverance that Christ offers each and every one of us requires dedication to a life of holiness. The 3 Hebrew men are an example for us to follow for a life of holiness. And they teach us the importance of a faith unwilling to compromise with the justifications of our culture. But this is my final challenge to my generation. May we be the generation that is willing to take a stand against demanding distractions. May we be a generation that is willing to defy corrupted kingdoms. And may we finally be a generation that's dedicated to our God and his holy word. Thank you.
Thank you for joining our broadcast today.
For additional information, please visit us on our website, our Facebook page, or Twitter.